Hey, this is Alice from Alice in Muggleland, and I just want to thank our listener who sent in the questions for our last episode, and I really want more because between you and me, these questions that Bilius keeps bringing from the wizarding community are just kind of the worst. So if you have any questions about the stories, about book one, about book two, about the first movie, about Bilius, send them in. I'd love to answer them. Even if I don't know what the answer is, I will come up with something because it's got to be better than those questions he keeps coming up with. Thanks. And you can send those in via Facebook, via Twitter, or via email.
This is Alice in Muggleland, with the man who would be Hufflepuff, Bilius McDaniels, and Alice, the mudblood who joined the Hogwarts Express.
Hey, Alice.
What's up, Bill?
Welcome back. It's season 2.
Thank you. It's exciting to be back.
And we did actually get another question in between our seasons. We had a couple of them from Scott Chupak. I may have butchered the name. I do apologize, Scott. The first question, which is probably the lengthier answer, and he's confusing literature with historical documents, but we can't all be perfect. Alice, now that you've read Rowling's first book, I was hoping you would compare her style to some of your favorite young adult authors, including J.R.R. Tolkien and Lewis Carroll, of course. What aspects of novel writing is Rowling especially good at compared to her contemporaries, and what aspects are frustrating to you?
So I think the most comparable set of books that I read when I was growing up were the C.S. Lewis Narnia books. And some of the parallels are really obvious. The biggest one almost certainly being between the wardrobe and the 9 3/4 platform. In fact, in one of C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, the children actually do get whisked off of a train platform. So I think that might have been sort of a nod to Lewis's work. One of the reasons that these things are so comparable, these storylines to me, is the very complete world building that the author must do, but it's always in parallel with our actual world. We have non-magical people being transported magically into a magical kingdom in the Narnia books, and something similar happening here with No-Mages occasionally getting caught up in the magical adventures of wizards and wizarding kind. I think a difference is that in the case of C.S. Lewis, of course, he's going very much more into the sort of fantastical realms, and the question mentioned Tolkien, which of course is sort of a high fantasy. I've never really thought of those books as being young adult books, but it's an interesting analogy to make. There are some similarities even there. Of course, some other stories that I just love are, The Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum's series of stories about Dorothy landing in Oz after being in Kansas. And again, a no-mage, non-magical being getting swept up into a magical realm where the normal rules and laws of physics do not necessarily apply. Writing style, these writers, including, and especially if we include Lewis Carroll, very, very different styles of writing. And it's kind of like trying to compare apples and oranges. But one difference is I think Rowling does a lot more exposition. I'm not honestly sure how many of the Narnia books or the Oz books or even Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and then Through the Looking Glass. I don't know how many of these books were planned in advance as one continuous story, but it's very obvious from the way book 1 ended in this series that book 2 was on the horizon. I would be willing to bet that Rowling had planned out at least one book for each year at Hogwarts. or something to that effect. She had this sort of continuous storyline mapped out, probably even as she was writing the very first book. Even with that, she's still having these periodic moments where a character is coming along to explain everything that happened outside of view of the reader. So, for example, at the end of book 1, we have Dumbledore showing up in the hospital ward, and he's explaining everything that happened that wasn't witnessed right there at Hogwarts by Harry and his friends. And that's not something I've encountered a lot of in other sort of fantastical stories. You end up with what, for lack of a better term, are sort of side quests where, these other authors go off and explain in great detail, sometimes in excruciating detail, about a relatively minor plot point that's happening somewhere else. That's a big difference and a big change. And I'm sure some people like it and some people don't. So it's a difference. Character-wise, these characters they all have similarities. They all have difference. I mean, the big one, of course, is this idea of somebody who's not particularly magical being pulled into a magical world. In the case of the Harry Potter books, of course, though, Harry is magical. Magical things have been happening to him his whole life. He just didn't know why and just was kind of coming up with his own conjectures. And I'm hoping that later in these books, we get into what he really thought was happening when, the snake would slither by. It's like he sort of had an expectation like that is something that doesn't normally happen. And yet he wasn't just completely shocked. So I kind of like to know what his thought process was and how he explained to himself how these magical incidents would occur. Yeah, I think I've answered that question. That's a really good question.
All right, and Scott has one more question. Alice, before you watched the first movie, I was wondering what actors you pictured in your head were playing the parts of Harry, Ron, Hermione, Dumbledore, Hagrid, etc.
Yeah, I would love to come up with a roster of like really cool, hip, indie actors and actresses to populate these roles. But contrary to popular belief, I have not been living under a rock the past 20 years. So even though I hadn't seen the movies or read the books, I knew about them. I've seen the movie posters. I've seen the trailers. As I'm reading these books, I'm picturing, the movies as they were cast. And I'm okay with that because I think, without having seen them yet, that the casting was probably pretty well done. But yes, as I'm reading these books, I'm not, unfortunately, maybe I'm not getting the experience of picturing what these characters look like. In fact, sometimes when there's a description in the book that clashes with how they actually look in the movie, I'm experiencing a little cognitive dissonance because in the books, Harry Potter is being described as having jet black hair. And of course, because of having seen the movie posters and the trailers and stuff, that's not exactly how I picture him.
All right, so are you ready to dive in with both feet for this journey of season 2?
Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. One thing aside, just about the title, there are a lot of secrets in this story. And I started thinking about that as I was kind of considering the title of book 2. Going into book 1, I didn't know what a philosopher or sorcerer's stone was going to be or what that was going to represent. But a Chamber of Secrets, after book 1, everybody in this book has got secrets that are coming out in bits and pieces here and there. And we get glimpses of them occasionally in a mirror that shows them their deepest desires. But secrets. This is a universe of lots and lots of secrets. I'm really interested to find out exactly what secrets this chamber holds.
Well, the first thing that is not secretive is Chapter 1, The Worst Birthday.
Yeah, so last year on Harry's birthday, it was sort of like a dream come true. He is suddenly, that is his experience of being whisked into the wizarding world fully. It starts on his birthday.
Yep. The best birthday.
The very best birthday. And now, well, things have changed for him. We find him back at the Dursleys. Doesn't use this term, but he is profoundly homesick for Hogwarts. He feels like that is where he belongs, that is where his friends are, and he has been cut off pretty much entirely by the Dursleys. He's not allowed to communicate with his friends by a owl. So even Hedwig is being punished. All of his magical stuff has been locked up in the cupboard that he used to live in under the stairs. And the M word for magic is forbidden. It cannot be spoken in the house. This comes back to something I talked about in book 1. The analogy here, I mean, the very first, the first 2 or 3 pages of this chapter, this feels like a story in which somebody has come out, to their unaccepting relatives as gay. And it's just being, hushed up and not spoken of. And I just can't help but see this as just a very strong analogy for the LGBT experience if you are young and growing up in a family that doesn't accept you. And it's I can see why this series of books would be so powerful for a kid who is going through something like that themselves.
Well, another thing is, as you can tell, the Dursleys don't know anything about owls, because keeping an owl cooped up in a cage that long, where they can't stretch their wings, can get that owl a very angry itch.
I'm going to tell you something, Bill. Most no-mages don't know anything about keeping owls. It's not a common pet at all.
Well, I gotta just fend with Harry with this. He's like, she's getting bored. She needs to be let out. And Dursley's like, no.
Yeah, well,
I would not let that owl out.
I mean, that seems reasonable, but most no-mages are not going to know that about owls. Though, to be fair,
poor Hedwig.
Most animals get really cranky if you don't let them out to entertain themselves, and they get bored and feisty. And honestly, most people too. That maybe that's not about owls. Maybe that's just, don't lock people up where they can't stretch out. Otherwise, they get bored and feisty.
Yeah, we don't even leave our rats in cages, so I understand that. So Harry finds out that his birthday's starting to suck, and it's just going to get worse, because he finds out that he's basically going to be, today is the day that he's basically going to be locked up all day.
Right. So not only are the Dursleys not acknowledging his birthday in any way, he hasn't heard from Ron or Hermione. And I have a feeling we're going to get an explanation for that at some point, because I can't imagine that those two aren't writing him. It feels like somewhere the Dursleys are blocking their communication to him somehow, but he feels utterly forgotten. The Dursleys, of course, aren't acknowledging his birthday. He hasn't heard from anybody at Hogwarts all summer. And he is going to be a prisoner in the Dursleys' house while they host an important dinner party. I got to tell you, this chapter has all the makings of something really, really disastrous is going to happen at this dinner party. I don't know what yet, because I haven't gotten into chapter 2, but something disastrous is going to happen at this dinner party, because it's destined to fail. Mr. Dursley is trying to orchestrate every movement of both his wife and his son. Harry's one and only job is to stay quiet in his room as if he doesn't exist, because apparently the Dursleys have yet to tell their close associates that he exists, and they don't want to explain it now. And I have to admit that would probably be sort of awkward to explain who this person was that's living in your house that you've never ever mentioned. But yeah, so Harry's one and only job is to stay quiet in his room, and I just have a feeling he's not going to be able to do that. But I'm not exactly sure why yet. We have an inkling with Harry out in the yard trying to enjoy some sunshine on his birthday, and he sees a giant pair of eyes staring at him from the hedge, which I think most of us will admit is somewhat unusual. Hedges don't usually stare at you like that.
He's outside right now so depressed he would rather even see Malfoy.
That's really depressed. As Harry's wishes unspoken wishes have come true in the past, as mentioned in book 1, I'm a little worried about what this profound loneliness is going to conjure. It has something to do with what's staring at him from the hedge, I suspect, but we don't know yet. And then, of course, his cousin waddles up to him. Again, more fat shaming. I get that these are really bad people, but I don't know why we have to keep, focusing on how fat his cousin is. I don't know. It just bugs me a little bit. Anyway, he waddles up to him and kind of incites him into babbling some nonsense words so that he can go and tattle to his mother that Harry is using magic. Very wisely, Harry has not told the Dursleys that he's not allowed to use magic away from Hogwarts. So well played, Harry.
But to give Dudley credit, he does acknowledge that it is Harry's birthday.
He does. Dudley remembers it's his birthday, which I'm not really sure how, but he does. That surprised me a little bit. Yeah, so he got his birthday acknowledged. He didn't really get birthday greetings or whatever from Dudley. That's almost worse than no greetings.
It does just go show about the Dudley being a bully, about talking about how come he doesn't have any friends at his weird school and things of that nature.
Right, yeah. So Dudley uses this opportunity to sort of wheedle him about the fact that he hasn't heard anything from his friends. But again, I suspect that that's the Dursleys' fault somehow. I just don't know how yet.
All right. I'm not going to get into the reasoning behind that, because we're going to get into that in the next chapter. However, let me ask this question. If Vernon couldn't stop a ton of letters getting to Harry last year, do you really think he, in all of Vernon's brilliance or Petunia's brilliance, figured out a way to stop letters coming to the house from wizards?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't have an explanation for why Harry is not hearing from his friends. He does go along with the plan. He helps his aunt as a form of punishment for, spooking Dudley, get everything ready in the house. And he wolfs down his very meager dinner and heads upstairs. I have just a bad feeling about this pudding that's described as being on top of the fridge. It sounds really pretty. It's got, crystallized violets on it, and that just sounds lovely. But I have a feeling we wouldn't have heard a description of it if something really bad wasn't going to happen to that dessert. So I'm nervous. I'm nervous about what's going to go down at this dinner party. But the dinner party hasn't yet begun. Harry's gone up to his room to be quiet, and we're left on a cliffhanger. Somebody is in his room, but it doesn't say who.
Dun, dun, dun!
That's where we're at. Who's in the room?
As I usually ask, who is your favorite person of this chapter?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna have to go with Harry, because he's pretty much the only tolerable person in this chapter. And I'm starting to feel bad that Harry's almost never my favorite character, so Harry is my favorite character in this chapter.
All right. So is there anything else that might have... This was a pretty short
chapter. It's a short little chapter. It ends on this cliffhanger. I'm looking forward to getting into chapter 2 and finding out who's in Harry's room.
So next time you see us, we will be going over chapter 2, Dobby's Warning. Now, this is our second season, and there's a lot that we want to do. As it was mentioned at the very, very beginning, we would like you to give us questions about the first book or the second book, and our wizards will go through and make sure they're put into the proper chapters so Alice doesn't receive any spoilers. So how can they do that, Alice?
Well, they can reach out for us on Facebook. That's probably the best way to reach us. They can also reach us on Twitter and by email. But right now, I have a question.
What's that?
Who's Dobby?
Well, you're going to find out in chapter 2.
Oh.
Dun, dun, dun! The Facebook is located at www.facebook.com/AllisonMuggleland, via email at AllisonMugglelandPodcast@gmail.com. We also have a Twitter that, to be quite honest, neither of us regularly check, because Twitter is one of those things that you have to be very active on to deal with. But if you're a fan of Twitter, we get reminders. That's A in Muggleland for our Twitter address. Also, we're growing on Patreon. We have bonus footage. We're going to be doing some more bonus features for that as soon as we get all the time squared away. And that's going to be that Patreon is www.patreon.com/VicariousMuggleland. So next week, our chapter is Dobby's Warning. Do you have any other questions, Alice?
No, I think that's everything.
All right. Well, in that case, folks, see you next episode. Nox. This is a question from Bilious McDaniels. What is role-playing?
Oh, God, it's going to be hard not to laugh, but I'm going to try my best. Okay.
Hey, me deadpanning it is going to be the hard part.
Well, yeah, see, I'm allowed to giggle and you're not, so you're right. As usual, you have the much harder job on this podcast than I do.